Could you briefly explain how radionics evolved and the history behind it?
Well, radionics developed in the late 19th century with the work of Dr. Albert Abrams of San Francisco, who was a highly trained and accredited physician of his day, and he noticed a certain reactivity in healthy people to pathological tissues, a certain responsiveness in the nervous system, which he could detect through percussing, which was the only means they had in those days of finding out what was going on inside the body without actually cutting it open. From this he developed a methodology whereby a healthy person and a person who was presumed to be ill could be linked together, and a kind of muscle testing of the healthy person took place with various types of pathological tissue in the circuit, and by the reactions of the healthy person he could allegedly tell if the person had certain diseases or not. This excited a great deal of interest at the time, and there was a great deal of derision and a great deal of praise. Some thought him a genius and some thought him quite a madman, charlatan. And one may add that this has surrounded radionics from its very beginning, but nevertheless it has continued over the past 100 years with a succession of persons. Ruth Drown came after Abrams, and in the early 1920s radionics was brought to Britain, where a number of people such as Guyan Richards, Dillawar, Tansley, Malcolm Ray and others over the following decades developed it into the art that it has become now. The last of these people was Tansley, who died about 1986-87. And some of these people were pretty bright, and they came up with some very interesting ideas and concepts as to how this could be done. There were, of course, many others in the United States, some in Europe, and of course in the UK. That is the basic gist of it. I should add that agricultural radionics was introduced in the United States about 1949-1950 by Upton and Knuth, who again had apparently great success with their work. Anyone who wants to read up on this can read Report on Radionics by Russell, which is an excellent summary of the basic history of radionics. So that gives you a very rough idea of the timeline. There's about 100 years in this, or slightly more. Radionics is basically a therapeutic discipline which can be used to treat humans, animals, which is veterinary radionics, and plants, crops and soils, agricultural radionics. It is contentious because in orthodox science no means by which the proposed radionic action can take place are found. I would argue, although I cannot necessarily prove, that there are in fact means, some of which are found within the body of the scientific thought, particularly of the last century. But I'm not here to prove or disprove anything. I'm just here to explain it. What anyone may think is their business. Essentially, radionics combines some form of radiesthesic activity, such as pendulum dowsing, with the use of codes, and codes represent things that you want to discover or test. And the codes were discovered by a distinct method, a distinct development over quite some decades by the pioneers and the use of codes. I won't go into that at this point, but basically we can say that there are two groups of radionic codes. There are many ways of making radionic codes. Some are more efficient and effective in their objectives than others, but there are basically two types. One is what we may call presets, which are descriptions of energies which are found already in nature. For example, flower remedies, the arcana of homeopathic remedies, metals, elements, crystals, gems, so on and so forth. The others are what we might call commands, or therapeutic commands, where the therapist makes an instruction which he wishes to apply to the patient. For example, eliminate toxins from gastrointestinal tract, eliminate poor self-image, and many, many others. Thousands of other such commands can be constructed, and they can be coded using various means and used possibly to therapeutic effect.
Could you talk to us about how you would go through a radionic analysis and the equipment you would use to do it?
Well, the first thing is that you will obviously be contacted by a patient, a potential patient, someone who's looking for help. And I would say that the greater part of persons who at least come to me, and probably most other radionic practitioners, have already been through the orthodox medical system and have not had a result which was satisfactory to them. And in many cases, the situation is difficult. They come with difficult problems. So it is already probably quite a tricky starting situation. But essentially, you are going to take a case history. You're going to talk to the person. It could be by phone, could be by email, etc. And you're going to find out what the symptoms are, what happened, what is the medical history, what is the psychological history, and so forth. Whatever the patient wants to tell you. We're not psychotherapists. I do not ask people, for example, to reveal the details of the trauma which may have happened. If the patient wants to tell you, fair enough. If they don't, you leave it as something for the future. Once you've done that and they have agreed for radionic analysis and treatment, they send you, and here obviously I'm saying the patient could be anywhere in the world. Could be next door, could be any place you want. The distance is of no object. And we will cover the basic ideas to how this can be done later, I would think. The snip of hair, or perhaps a dried spot of dried blood, is generally referred to as the witness. And the witness, which you use in the analysis, stands in for the person. It is their representative in front of you. It's your connection to them. And what you then do is you analyze them according to a model of the human system. And one of the things we will note in contemporary radionics is that it presumes, generally speaking, that the human being, the human organism, and in fact all living organisms, have a more or less complex energy field. And this energy field can be subdivided into various regions, which can be broadly categorized as causal, informational, and energetic. And none of these three things are viewed with any great deal of credence by orthodox medicine or orthodox science. So what we're dealing with is a situation where we believe that we analyse and treat something which may or may not exist. The practitioner, and as is found in many other forms of alternative medicine such as Ayurveda, Chinese traditional medicine and so forth, homeopathy believe that such an energy field exists, but the dividing line between modern medicine and most of the rest is that on the one hand is that energy is paramount, on the other that on the orthodox side that essentially chemical reactions are paramount. In the orthodox model there is a failure of some kind of biochemical process in the body which can be remedied by the administration of a drug. In the alternative medicines, there is the idea that the body has an energy field which has somehow gone wrong, which then results in symptoms in the body, and this can be fixed by applying some form of, usually fixed by some form of energy. But there is a great divide between these two methods. And the orthodox position is that all this other stuff basically doesn't exist. Maybe we could even say it's a fantasy. Nothing to be done about that. We do what we do, and as long as we do it ethically and honestly, then that is, and the patient has agreed to the treatment, then that is what we do. The model can be more or less complex. In the way I work, it is a fairly complex model which ranges from analogues of the physical organs in the body. We might call this the paraphysical body, psychological, emotional and psycho-spiritual and purposive aspects of the human nature. And again, this is rather lengthy to describe in full detail, but it is a rather comprehensive model. Now, the places where in this structure are referred to as locations. And then what we test for is various factors. And factors can be grouped, and there can be many factors, but essentially we look at things such as infection, inflammation, autoimmune response, energy blockages, miasmatic conditions, which comes from homeopathy, nutritive and enzymatic deficiencies, and so on and so forth. It's quite a wide range that you can test for. And using the pendulum, you test using an appropriate instrument and charts, and you look for deviations from zero. So if you look at, let's say, a person's respiratory system and the reading is zero, you will assume that there's probably little wrong with it, or little of significance wrong with it. If you get a reading of, let's say, 90 for bacterial infection, you may find that this confirms something that the patient has already told you, which is that they have a lung infection or something like that. So you're reading 0 to 100% for deflection. And generally speaking, the higher that reading, the more serious the situation is. But not necessarily, because even a small reading for some things can indicate problems, severe problems. But you have to be very careful, and you have to be very careful what you look at. Of course, you're going to ask the patient, have you been to the doctor? Because this is the way the system works. Have you been to the doctor? And of course, they may have been through the doctor system. And you may see other things which alarm you. And in that case, you may suggest to the patient that gently that they go back to the doctor. You shouldn't say things which can bring about an alarm or fearful state in the patient. In the end, things which alarm you should be passed back for proper testing in an appropriate manner. Once you have done that and you have constructed your analysis, you then try to work out where you should apply treatment. And as I say, the idea is that disturbances in the energy field result in symptoms. And this is a position, for example, also put forward in homeopathy. So the disturbance here has, in the end, some kind of manifestation as whatever, the skin eruption, the asthma, whatever the patient may have come with. So you look for energies which counteract that. And you can work with a rather wide range of possible treatments, which could in fact extend as far as 30 to 50,000 in number, potentially, at least, possibly many more. For example, the whole arcana of homeopathic remedies, and here I say you can apply homeopathic remedies at a distance to the patient. The arcana of flower essences, the arcana of gems and minerals, and many, many others, and the vast range, potential range of radionic commands, which I mentioned earlier. And commands are essentially activated thought forms. Everyone and humanity has been, since the beginning of civilization, let's say, or the beginning of thinking, making thought forms. But in radionics, we make very specific thought forms, which we try and reinforce in order to project them to the patient to bring about some change of state in them towards a better state of health, better condition of health. So this is the real essence of radionics, the production of active thought forms or therapeutic commands. Does that give you a satisfactory?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the whole cornerstone of radionics seems to be the concept that energy precedes form in the whole universe. Can you tell us basically about how this came to be and the people who influenced this kind of esoteric
line of thinking?
I know you mentioned Alice Bailey a lot in your book, like on the work she did
yes.
on the rays and chakras.
Well, just a brief aside on Alice Bailey. Alice Bailey was introduced into the radionic model by David Tansley. I myself am no particular follower of Alice Bailey, but this is the legacy that we are left with by Tansley. And rather than simply tear it all down, I thought it better to work with these remnants of Bailey's work, which have been inserted into the radionic model, because they do have some validity. The whole of Bailey's work is very large. I mean, I can't remember, is it 28 volumes or something like that, or 30 volumes. And most of what Tansley took was taken from one book, which is Esoteric Healing. But what he did do was he shifted radionic thinking from a very physicalized approach to a more esoteric and spiritual approach by introducing this type of model. And the idea is that form has emanated from some kind of creative principle in the universe, or that's to be more precise, some kind of creative principle inherent in nature. And this is the essential aspect. Radionics is not something which is trying to prove creationism or modern science, modern scientific theories such as neo-Darwinism or intelligent design or any concept like this. What we are trying to do is look into the interior construction of an aspect, the consciousness aspect of nature. So again, modern materialistic science, or modern science which is materialistic, would say that there is no principle, teleological or other principle in nature which guides it, which drives it in any direction. And I would certainly agree that that is an aspect of what we do find in nature. But nevertheless, when you start looking into it and you go further and further, you get the idea that there is some kind of guiding mechanism in nature itself. And the problem comes when you try to explain the radionic codes. Because you make a radionic code, a radionic rate or an active symbol and so forth, which you use in the instrument. And if you think, because I'm not claiming that radionics has any particular application or use, but if you think that they work, then you ask yourself, what do these codes represent? Where do they come from? How are they generated? And this is the the essence of the matter. What are we reading? And after, again, very lengthy consideration, I come to the general conclusion that there is at least a third essential characteristic of the universe, which is information. So you've got energy and matter, that's standard physics, but you've also got information. The idea of information is also in physics, but it's not generally spoken about in the same way. But this information, certainly at the level of study of physics, is described by mathematics. What we're looking for is the formative forces that describe how things come into existence. So when we create radionic codes, we are attempting to penetrate with our minds, not with a Large Hadron Collider, but with our minds and the attunement and development of the individual consciousness. We're attempting to penetrate into the inner side of nature and to, as it were, capture it by the use of appropriate codes and symbology, and these can then be used to evoke the respective energies using the instruments that we have. And there are, again, a very large range of instruments, and there is a lot of confusion about what the instruments do, why they do it, and how to design them, which is a very long discussion. But essentially, the instruments, in my view, are a three-dimensional adjustable symbol, which is a reflection of a process which is happening at the level of consciousness. And the process which is happening is that you, the therapist, are projecting your therapeutic healing intent to the patient, and you are refining it and tuning it through the use of the codes and strengthening it through the use of the instruments. So that instead of it just being you sitting there thinking, I'd like person X to get better, you are actively promoting and strengthening that intention in very specific ways.
And presumably that intention can be left to run on its own on the device, and you can turn your attention to other things.
Yes, absolutely. If you lived in some kind of ideal environment with no disturbance, no modern life, and so on and so forth, then perhaps you could sit there for 18 hours a day and focus your mind on the people who come to you for help. But this would be very draining and of limited effectiveness, because you would in due time wear yourself out. So one of the great uses of the instruments is it is a kind of sample and hold mechanism, whereby you can take your intention and capture it, put it, as it were, in the instrument and leave it to do the work for you. Of course, you're going to check and adjust, but nevertheless, that is the general idea.
Okay. What inspired you to write 21st Century Radionics?
Well, I've been basically studying radionics since about 1995, and in fact homeopathy since 1994. And I'll tell you quite frankly that on both things I thought they were absolutely ludicrous when I first encountered them. I thought they were far detached from reality, but nevertheless, being of the mind that I am, I decided to investigate them to see whether this belief was supportable or not, and consequently I have continued now for quite some years. As the years 2000 went on, I started to get increasing amounts of inquiries from people all the time saying, what is radionics, what's it all about, and most particularly, how can it possibly work? So by the time I got to about 2008, 2009, I thought I'd better write all this down. And some few people also urged me to write it down because, you could drop dead and then it's gone. Or lose interest or whatever. So I sat down to write, and I realised I thought it would be quite a simple thing, quite a simple book to do. Just write, this is what we do and this is it. This is how we do it and that's that. A kind of cookbook or instruction manual. But the problem that kept looming up at every moment really was this question of how can it possibly work? And that's when things got very, very tricky, because you ask yourself, well, how could it possibly work? And at that time, I had no real idea. And I met in the States, had a brief conversation with a lady who was a professor of art and Jungian psychotherapy. And she started talking about archetypes and Jungian symbols and so forth. And of course I'd heard of Jung, but I hadn't really gone into what he had to say. So this was something clicked in my head, and I thought, well, I better figure this out. And as I started reading up on Jung, I found out that he had had as a patient Wolfgang Pauli for many years, and Wolfgang Pauli was one of the founders of quantum mechanics. So again, I started thinking, well, what is this quantum mechanics? And gradually I thought, well, I'd better learn something about quantum mechanics. So and as I got pushed into these areas, I started to realize that between the two aspects, the Jungian concept and the quantum mechanical concepts, might lie some kind of explanation as to how radionics works. And a very simple explanation is that everything which exists emanates from and is interconnected by a common informational field, which you might call a holographic information field, which permeates or underlies the whole universe. This is, again, is not a new idea in esoteric theory, because in Indian, or perhaps yogic principles, there is the idea of the Akashic record, which is the record of everything which has been since the beginning of time, is all recorded in some kind of stratum, and which can be gone into, studied and retrieved by appropriate means. And a famous retriever was the medium Edgar Cayce, who was quite well known in his day, the so-called sleeping prophet. And this fellow was a farm boy who would go into a trance, and someone would come to him, a patient would come to him, he would go into a trance, and he allegedly could read the Akashic record concerning this person's life, incarnations, destiny and so forth. And in the trance he would tell them which medicines to take or which way to get out of their health problems and so on and so forth. So there's precedent from this from all sides, from esoteric, from, in a sense, science and psychology and so forth. So I work with the assumption that this exists. And again, in quantum mechanics we have the idea of quantum entanglement, which is that all particles, or if two particles are connected, then no matter what the distance between them, they are instantaneously connected forever. And this again is supported by theory and experiment, Bell's theorem of non-locality. So there are many of these ideas lying around, and essentially what I considered was that radionics is a means by which we read this informational field, and we read, if you want, the purposive or intentional field of nature. And we also, to an extent, can access the energetic side. And the energetic side, again, does not refer to energy which is found in physics, but refers to the more esoteric form of energy, which is referred to as ki in Chinese philosophy and prana in yogic philosophy, and so on. And again, there is a long, long history of these energies. So I weighed all this up and spent a very large amount of time focused on these matters, and I came to the conclusion that somehow human beings have an ability innate to them that they can connect to this energy and information field. They can access it by codes which can be constructed to enable the use of these energies, either in the analysis of the patient or the treatment of the patient. And again, there is an analogy from science, which is mathematics. Mathematics describes what things will do, what forces and energies will do within the parameters of physics, but the mathematics, which may describe very accurately what happens, is not the reality itself. And this is the very deep problem of how human consciousness interacts with the underlying reality. To what extent can we really find, understand and contact reality? But I won't dwell on that too much because it's a very lengthy discussion.